The moment a woman feels truly safe with a man, it's almost never because he said the perfect thing. It's because he didn't rush to fill the silence. That sounds counterintuitive. Most men are taught the opposite, that talking more builds comfort, that explaining yourself builds trust, that words create connection. But deep down, on a psychological level, women experience safety very differently. And in a moment, you're going to understand why the men who speak less, not out of insecurity, not out of manipulation, but out of inner calm, often create the strongest emotional pull without even trying. You felt this before, even if you couldn't explain it. You're sitting with her. There's a pause in the conversation. You feel it, that subtle tension. Your instinct kicks in, say something, keep it going, don't let it get awkward. So you talk, you explain, you fill the space. And she smiles. But something shifts. She's still there, but she's not leaning in anymore. What most men never realize is that silence itself communicates. And women are far more sensitive to what silence means than to what words say. To understand this, we need to slow down and look beneath behavior into emotional perception. Women don't experience safety through information. They experience safety through emotional regulation. A man who speaks constantly is often unconsciously signaling that he needs control over the moment. He needs reassurance. He needs to manage how he's perceived, not because he's bad, but because he's not settled. And women feel that immediately. You see, the female nervous system is highly attuned to emotional undercurrents. Before she analyzes what you're saying, her body is already asking a deeper question. Is this man grounded, or is he trying to hold himself together? Silence answers that question faster than words ever could. A man who can sit in silence without anxiety is showing something rare. He's showing that he doesn't need constant external validation to feel stable. He doesn't need to perform. He doesn't need to rush connection. And that creates a quiet sense of safety that's hard to describe but impossible to fake. Think about the men you've known who talk the least. Not the cold ones, not the withdrawn ones, but the calm ones. The men whose presence feels solid, whose words feel measured, who don't explain themselves unless it matters. They're not silent because they're unsure. They're silent because they're at ease, and that ease communicates something powerful. If things slow down, I'm still okay. For a woman, that's huge, because emotional safety isn't about constant reassurance. It's about consistency under pressure. Now here's where most men get confused. They think women feel safer with men who speak less because silence is mysterious, or because it creates intrigue. That's not the core reason. Mystery can attract, yes, but safety comes from something deeper. Silence becomes comforting when it's backed by emotional strength. A man who goes quiet because he's scared is very different from a man who goes quiet because he's present. Women feel the difference instantly. One silence feels tense, the other feels spacious. One feels like avoidance. The other feels like confidence, and the body responds accordingly. This is why overcommunication often backfires. When you overexplain your intentions, your feelings, your thoughts, especially early on, you're not increasing clarity. You're increasing emotional noise. You're asking her nervous system to process too much, too fast, and instead of safety, she feels pressure. Pressure to respond correctly. Pressure to reassure you. Pressure to match your emotional pace. That pressure doesn't feel like intimacy. It feels like responsibility. And attraction quietly fades when responsibility replaces curiosity. Now let's bring this into a real moment. Imagine you're on a date, she shares something personal, not dramatic, just honest. Many men immediately respond with advice, explanations, long affirmations, but the man who feels safest often does something else. He listens, he pauses, he lets her words land, he doesn't rush to fix, he doesn't rush to prove empathy. His silence says, I can hold this. That's emotional containment. And psychologically, containment equals safety. Because when a woman feels emotionally held, she can relax, and when she relaxes, attraction grows naturally. This is why women often say things like, I don't know why, but I feel calm around him. I can just be myself with him. He doesn't make things complicated. They're not responding to silence itself. They're responding to the absence of emotional urgency. A man who speaks less isn't trying to steer the interaction. He's allowing it to unfold. And that tells her something critical. If emotions rise, this man won't collapse. Now here's an uncomfortable truth most men avoid. Talking too much is often an attempt to control how you're perceived. Silence requires trust in yourself. It requires the belief that you don't need to be constantly impressive to be worthy of attention. And women are drawn to that belief because it feels stable. In a world where so many men are trying to prove something, the man who doesn't feels rare. But we're just getting started, because silence alone isn't what creates safety. Part 2, there's a critical distinction most men never learn, and missing it changes everything. Silence does not automatically create safety. It reveals what's already there. When a man is silent because he's disconnected from himself, the silence feels heavy, unsettled, like something is being withheld. A woman senses that as emotional absence. But when a man is silent because he's grounded, because he's present in his body and comfortable with his inner world, the silence feels open, inviting. Safe. This is why two men can say almost nothing and create completely different reactions. One makes her uneasy, the other makes her exhale. Female psychology is deeply somatic. Before logic, before interpretation, there is sensation. Her body is constantly scanning for cues. Not danger in the dramatic sense, but instability. And instability isn't loud, it's subtle, it shows up as restlessness, as the feeling that she has to keep things moving, as the sense that if she doesn't talk, something might fall apart. A man who speaks too much is often trying to prevent that collapse, but a man who is comfortable in silence is signaling that nothing needs to be propped up. This is where emotional intelligence lies. Not in what you say, but in how you regulate yourself when nothing is being said. Think about how often men talk at women instead of being with them. Filling space, narrating their thoughts, explaining emotions before they've even settled. It's not connection, it's anxiety disguised as engagement. And women feel the anxiety long before they hear the words. That anxiety triggers something primal. If a man can't sit with his own emotions, how will he handle hers? If he needs constant expression to feel okay, what happens when things get uncomfortable? This is why safety and attraction are intertwined. Safety doesn't mean predictability, it means capacity. The capacity to stay steady when emotions deepen. Silence tests that capacity, and women watch closely, not consciously, instinctively. Hear what's rarely said out loud. When a woman begins to trust a man emotionally, she actually starts to speak more. She fills the space. Not because she's nervous, but because she feels held. Her nervous system relaxes enough to expand. This is the paradox. Men who speak less often hear more because their presence creates room, and that room becomes intimacy. But this only works when silence isn't a strategy. The moment silence is used to provoke, punish, or manipulate, it loses its power. Women sense intention. A silent man who is withholding is very different from a silent man who is available. One creates tension. The other creates depth, and this is where boundaries quietly come into play. A man who doesn't feel the need to constantly speak is often a man with clear internal boundaries. He knows what matters to him. He knows when to engage. He knows when to let things breathe. He's not afraid of being misunderstood in the moment because he trusts himself over immediate approval. That trust is magnetic, not because it's flashy, but because it's rare. Now let's talk about something even deeper. Silence gives women space to feel, and feeling is where attachment forms. When a man talks nonstop, he dominates the emotional field. There's no room for her internal experience to rise, but when he slows down, when he lets moments stretch, something shifts. She starts to notice her own reactions, her own curiosity, her own desire. And that's when attraction becomes self-generated. She's not responding to him chasing. She's responding to what she feels around him. This is why women often say things like, "I don't know what it is, but I think about him." Silence gives the mind space to wander, and where the mind wanders, emotion follows. But again, this only works when silence comes from self-respect, not from fear. A man who speaks less because he's afraid to express himself creates confusion. A man who speaks less because he chooses his moments creates clarity. Women crave clarity more than explanation. Clarity in emotional signals. Clarity in presence. Clarity in intention. And silence, when aligned with inner steadiness, delivers that clarity without a single sentence. In the next part, we're going to explore why women often feel more emotionally exposed around quiet men, and how that exposure deepens trust rather than pushing them away. Because once you understand that, you'll realize silence isn't about saying less. Part 3. When a woman begins to feel emotionally exposed around a man, most men panic without realizing it. They feel the shift. The conversations deepen. The pauses grow longer, her questions become more personal, her energy softens, then pulls back, then returns. And the man thinks, "I'm losing her." But what's actually happening is the opposite. Emotional exposure is not a sign of danger for a woman. It's a sign that something real is forming, but only if the man knows how to hold it. Here's what's happening beneath the surface. When a man speaks less and remains emotionally present, a woman's internal world starts to come forward. Thoughts she normally suppresses begin to surface. Feelings she usually manages alone start to rise. And this is where silence becomes powerful in a way most men never understand, because silence removes distraction. Without constant verbal input, her attention turns inward. She starts noticing how she feels around you, not what you say. Not how impressive you sound, but how her body responds in your presence. Is she tense or relaxed? Does she feel rushed or unrushed? Does she feel observed or held? This internal scan is automatic, and when the answer is calm, something profound happens. Her guard lowers, not because she trusts you blindly, but because her nervous system isn't being overwhelmed. A man who talks constantly keeps her mind busy. A man who speaks intentionally allows her body to settle. And the body always tells the truth before the mind does. This is why women often open up more around quiet men, not because those men ask better questions, though sometimes they do, but because they don't interrupt the emotional process. They don't rush resolution. They don't jump to meaning. They don't try to guide her feelings. They let her arrive at them, and that creates ownership. When a woman feels something on her own, it becomes real. When she feels something because a man led her there verbally, it feels influenced. There's a difference, and women are deeply sensitive to that difference. Now here's where things get subtle. As her emotional exposure increases, her fear increases too. Not fear of you, fear of herself. Fear of caring, fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control. This is the moment when many men start talking more. They feel the emotional intensity rising and try to stabilize it with words, reassurance, labels, clarifications, but this is where silence matters most. Because when a man stays calm in the face of emotional exposure, he sends a powerful signal: I don't need you to protect me from your feelings. That signal changes everything. Most women have learned, often unconsciously, to regulate men's emotions, to soften themselves, to explain, to reassure. But when a man doesn't require that, she can finally rest. She can be messy, uncertain, quiet. And paradoxically, that freedom creates deeper attachment, because she's not performing anymore. She's being. This is why women often feel safer with men who speak less, not because those men are passive, but because they are emotionally self-contained. They don't leak anxiety into the space. They don't rush intimacy. They don't demand clarity before it's ready. They trust the process. And trust is contagious. Let's talk about attraction without romance for a moment. Attraction isn't built by stimulation alone. It's built by regulation. A regulated nervous system feels drawn to another regulated nervous system. Chaos attracts chaos temporarily, but stability attracts depth. When a woman senses that a man is internally stable, her system begins to synchronize with his. Her breathing slows, her voice softens, her movements become more fluid. These are not conscious choices. They are physiological responses, and silence amplifies them. Because without constant verbal engagement, the body has space to attune. This is why some women say things like, "It feels different with him. I feel grounded when I'm around him. I don't feel the need to be on." What they're describing is co-regulation. And co-regulation is the foundation of emotional safety. But here's the part most men misunderstand, and this is critical. Speaking less does not mean withholding your truth. It means not flooding the moment with unprocessed emotion. A grounded man still speaks, but his words come after clarity, not before it. He doesn't speak to relieve tension, he speaks to express alignment. That difference is felt instantly. A man who speaks to manage his own discomfort transfers that discomfort outward. A man who speaks from internal stillness brings others into that stillness. Now let's talk about masculinity, real masculinity, not the performative version. Masculine presence is spacious. It doesn't rush. It doesn't over-explain. It doesn't compete for attention, it allows. And allowance creates polarity, not through dominance but through contrast. A woman's emotional depth expands when there is room for it, and room is created through silence that is alive, not empty. You can feel the difference. An empty silence feels awkward. A full silence feels charged. The difference is presence. Presence is attention without agenda. When you're truly present, you don't feel the need to fill space. You're already in it. And women respond to that presence more than to any line, technique, or strategy. This is why men who are deeply centered often don't realize how attractive they are. They're not trying. They're not tracking reactions. They're not adjusting themselves moment to moment. They're simply there, and that there-ness becomes an anchor. Now here's an important moment to pause, because many men hear this and think, so I should just be quiet. No, silence is not a behavior, it's a byproduct. It's what happens when you no longer need to prove yourself, when you're not chasing validation, when you're not afraid of pauses, when you trust that connection doesn't disappear just because words stop. That trust comes from self-respect, and self-respect changes how you show up everywhere. When a woman feels that a man respects himself, she feels safer respecting her own boundaries around him. She doesn't feel pressured to respond. She doesn't feel pulled. She doesn't feel cornered emotionally. And ironically, that freedom makes her want to move closer, because desire needs space. Now let's bring this into a moment you've likely experienced. You send a message. She takes time to reply. Most men feel tension and immediately start composing explanations in their head. Maybe she's losing interest. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe I should follow up. But the man who speaks less internally and externally does something different. He notices the tension. He doesn't act on it. He lets time pass without narrating meaning into it. And when she replies, the interaction continues naturally. That calm response or lack of reaction signals emotional strength, not indifference, not coldness, strength. And women feel safer around strength because it's predictable, not in behavior but in emotional response. They know where they stand emotionally even if nothing is being said. And that's the paradox. Silence clarifies when it's backed by integrity. In the next part, we're going to go even deeper into why women often test quiet men emotionally and how responding with calm restraint builds trust instead of breaking it. Because once you understand those tests, silence stops feeling risky. It starts feeling natural. When a woman begins to feel emotionally safe with a man, something almost always follows. She tests the safety. Not consciously, not maliciously, but instinctively. Safety that hasn't been tested doesn't feel real. And this is where quiet men often stand out, not because they avoid these moments, but because they don't panic inside them. Emotional tests don't look dramatic, they look subtle: a delayed reply, a change in tone, a slightly distant energy, a comment that could be interpreted in more than one way. For men who rely on words to stabilize connection, these moments feel threatening. They rush to fix, to clarify, to explain intentions. But for a man who is grounded, these moments are simply information. He notices, he stays present, he doesn't abandon himself to manage her emotions. And that response, or more accurately, that non-reaction, communicates something profound. It says, I'm steady even when things shift. Women are not testing to see how much you care. They're testing to see how you regulate, because emotional safety is not about constant harmony. It's about resilience when harmony breaks. When a woman pulls back slightly and the man immediately fills the space with reassurance, she feels something tighten inside. Not because reassurance is bad, but because it signals fragility. Fragility requires care. And when she starts caring for your emotional state, the dynamic flips. She stops feeling held. She starts feeling responsible. But when a man allows distance without withdrawing emotionally, something else happens. She feels seen, not chased. She feels space, not abandonment. And that distinction matters more than most men realize. Silence during these tests isn't about playing hard to get. It's about trusting yourself enough to not collapse into reaction. A woman feels safer with a man who doesn't need immediate confirmation of connection, because it tells her the connection isn't built on pressure. Now let's talk about something rarely discussed. Many women have experienced men who start calm and then unravel as intimacy grows. They become hyperverbal, hyper-expressive, emotionally demanding. At first, it feels like passion. Then it feels like weight. So when a woman meets a man whose emotional tone stays consistent, whose silence doesn't turn cold, whose presence doesn't disappear, it stands out. It feels reliable. And reliability is deeply attractive when it's quiet. This is why women often lean toward men who don't overshare early on. Not because vulnerability is unattractive, but because premature vulnerability feels uncontained. A man who shares everything before he understands it himself is asking her to help process it. That doesn't feel safe. But a man who takes time with his emotions, who speaks after reflection, feels trustworthy. Because his words have weight. They don't spill out, they land. And silence is what gives them that weight. Now let's address a fear many men have but rarely admit. If I don't speak up, she'll think I don't care. This fear comes from equating expression with investment. But women don't measure care by quantity of words. They measure it by congruence. Does what you say align with how you show up? Does your tone match your presence? Does your silence feel attentive or detached? These nuances matter more than declarations. A man who speaks less but listens deeply communicates care without crowding. And listening is not passive. It's active restraint. It's choosing not to interrupt her process. It's allowing her to finish her thoughts without steering them. It's staying with discomfort instead of escaping it through talking. That ability creates emotional trust. Because trust is built when someone can hold space without controlling it. Now here's something subtle and powerful. When a man doesn't rush to respond, a woman often reveals more. She fills the silence. She clarifies her own thoughts. She goes deeper than she intended. Not because she's being manipulated, but because she feels safe enough to explore. And when she does, she bonds with her own expression. That bond gets associated with you, not because you said something brilliant, but because you didn't interrupt. This is how intimacy deepens quietly. But again, and this is crucial, this only works when silence is warm. Warm silence feels attentive. Cold silence feels dismissive. Warm silence includes eye contact, presence, stillness. Cold silence withdraws energy. Women can feel the difference instantly. One invites closeness, the other creates distance. This is why emotional maturity matters more than technique. A man who is emotionally present doesn't need to manage impressions. He trusts his presence to speak. And that trust relaxes the woman. Now let's slow this down further. Imagine a moment where she shares doubt, not about you directly, but about life, relationships, uncertainty. Many men rush to reassure, but reassurance too early can feel like erasure. It says, don't feel that. Silence says, you can feel that here. That permission is safety, and safety allows emotions to move instead of getting stuck. A woman who feels allowed to feel doesn't need to protect herself. She opens naturally, and openness is intimacy. As attraction deepens, silence begins to mean something different. In the early stages, silence is about presence. Later, it becomes about trust. This is where many connections either stabilize or quietly fall apart, because as emotional investment grows, so does sensitivity. Small shifts are felt more strongly. Pauses feel heavier. Absence carries more meaning. And this is when a man's relationship with his own silence truly matters. A man who is comfortable with himself doesn't use silence to disappear. He remains emotionally available even when he's not verbally present. That consistency is what women watch for. Not constant communication, but reliable energy. When a woman begins to care, she's not asking, will he text me enough? She's asking, is he still himself when things matter? Silence becomes the answer. A grounded man's silence feels the same on day one as it does later. It doesn't suddenly turn evasive. It doesn't become cold. It doesn't punish. It stays steady. And that steadiness allows a woman to relax into attachment instead of guarding against loss. This is where many men unknowingly break trust, not by saying the wrong thing, but by changing their emotional tone as intimacy increases. They become more reactive, more expressive, more needy. They start narrating feelings instead of holding them, and the woman feels the shift. She may not name it, but her body registers it as instability. This is why women sometimes pull back just as things start to feel close. Not because closeness is scary, but because the man's center starts to wobble. Silence disappears, replaced by emotional urgency. And urgency doesn't feel safe. It feels like pressure. Now let's talk about absence, because absence and silence are often confused. Absence is physical or temporal. Silence is emotional. A man can be absent and still emotionally present. He can also be physically there and emotionally absent. Women respond far more to emotional presence than to availability. A man who speaks less but remains emotionally anchored feels closer than a man who texts constantly but feels scattered. This is why quality of presence outweighs quantity of interaction. When a man trusts silence, he doesn't fear space. He doesn't chase reassurance when there's a gap. He doesn't interpret pauses as rejection, and because he doesn't panic, she doesn't either. Her nervous system mirrors his. This mirroring is subtle but powerful. Calm invites calm, stability invites trust. Now here's something deeper and often misunderstood. A woman doesn't feel safest when she's constantly emotionally understood. She feels safest when she doesn't have to manage understanding. When she doesn't need to explain herself repeatedly. When she doesn't need to soften her emotions so he stays okay. Silence from a grounded man removes that labor. It says, I can handle complexity without needing you to simplify. That's rare, and rarity creates value. This is why women often feel more themselves around quiet men. They don't feel interrogated. They don't feel analyzed. They don't feel rushed into coherence. They can be contradictory, unsure, evolving. And the man doesn't flinch. That non-flinching response is safety. Now let's bring this into conflict, because this is where silence reveals everything. Conflict doesn't require more words. It requires more regulation. A man who raises his voice, explains himself repeatedly, or argues to be understood is trying to regain control. A man who can pause, breathe, and respond thoughtfully is maintaining it. Silence in conflict is not avoidance when it's intentional. It's space for emotional settling. Women feel safer with men who don't escalate, not because they avoid issues, but because they don't let emotion drive behavior. This is emotional leadership. And leadership doesn't shout, it steadies. Now here's an uncomfortable truth. Many men talk because they're afraid silence will expose them. Expose uncertainty, expose desire, expose vulnerability. But silence doesn't create those things, it reveals them. And when a man has done the internal work, when he's not at war with himself, silence becomes a place of rest instead of threat. Women sense that rest. They lean into it because rest is safety. And safety is where love grows. Desire doesn't grow louder as it deepens, it grows quieter. This is something most men never realize. Early attraction is noisy. There's excitement, quick exchanges, energy moving fast. But lasting desire, the kind that stays, settles into stillness. And silence becomes charged. When a woman feels safe with a man, her desire doesn't need constant stimulation. It doesn't need clever words or constant reassurance. It needs space to breathe. Silence gives desire room to expand internally. Because desire isn't created by being told what to feel. It's created by being allowed to feel. A man who speaks less doesn't interrupt that process. He doesn't label the moment. He doesn't rush intimacy forward with words. He allows tension to exist, and tension is not discomfort when it's held calmly. It's anticipation. This is why women often feel stronger attraction to men who don't immediately verbalize interest, not because interest is hidden, but because it's contained. Contained desire feels powerful. It feels intentional. It feels like choice rather than impulse. Women are deeply responsive to that difference. Now let's talk about polarity, not as a concept, but as a felt experience. Polarity exists when there is contrast. Movement and stillness, expression and reception, emotion and containment. When a man speaks constantly, he collapses that contrast. There's no space for her energy to move toward him, but when he slows down, when he allows silence to stretch without anxiety, something shifts. She starts leaning in, not physically at first, emotionally. She becomes more curious, more aware, more attuned, because the silence isn't empty, it's attentive. Attention without pressure feels intimate. This is why a quiet look can feel more intense than a long conversation. Why a pause before responding can feel more meaningful than a paragraph. Silence amplifies presence, and presence amplifies desire. But here's the key distinction. This isn't about being aloof. Aloofness withdraws energy. Presence concentrates it. A man who speaks less but remains engaged through eye contact, posture, listening, creates a field of connection that words would only dilute. Women feel that field, they respond to it instinctively. Now let's bring this into moments of intimacy without crossing into explicit territory. Imagine sitting close, not touching. Nothing is being said. There's awareness, breath, stillness, time slowing. That moment carries more charge than 1,000 words because nothing is being forced. Nothing is being rushed, and the woman feels something awaken inside her not because the man did something, but because he didn't disrupt the moment. Men often underestimate how much attraction lives in restraint, not repression. Restraint signals self-control, and self-control feels safe, because a man who can contain his desire can also contain his emotions. And that containment allows a woman to explore hers. Now let's address a common fear. If I don't express desire, she'll think I'm not interested. But desire isn't communicated only through language. It's communicated through consistency, through focus, through how you show up. A man who is present, attentive, and grounded doesn't need to announce interest. It's felt, and what's felt is trusted more than what's said. This is why women often trust actions and energy over declarations. Words can be spoken impulsively. Presence cannot be faked for long. Now here's something deeper. Silence allows desire to become mutual rather than chased. When a man talks his desire into existence, the woman responds to him. When he allows space, she responds to herself. And self-generated desire is far stronger because it doesn't feel imposed. It feels chosen. This is why women sometimes pull back after a man expresses too much too soon, not because desire is unwelcome, but because it bypasses her internal process. Silence respects that process. It lets desire mature. Now consider how rare this is. In a world full of noise, explanation, and emotional oversharing, a man who can be quiet without disconnecting stands out immediately. He doesn't compete. He doesn't push. He doesn't rush outcomes. He allows moments to unfold. And unfolding creates depth. Depth creates attachment, not through intensity but through resonance. As time passes, attraction is no longer the main question. Safety is, not the safety of excitement, but the safety of reality. This is where silence becomes the foundation rather than the spark. Because real connection isn't tested in moments of chemistry. It's tested in moments of misunderstanding, disappointment, fatigue, uncertainty. And in these moments, how a man relates to silence determines whether trust deepens or erodes. Most men try to talk their way out of discomfort. They explain intentions. They justify reactions. They try to be understood immediately. But understanding cannot be forced. It has to be arrived at. A man who understands silence allows that arrival to happen naturally. He doesn't rush resolution to soothe his own anxiety. He lets emotions settle before meaning is assigned. And this creates emotional safety over time. Because a woman learns something crucial. She learns that emotions don't have to be fixed instantly to be held. That space doesn't mean abandonment. That quiet doesn't mean withdrawal. This learning rewires trust. Now let's talk about misunderstandings, because they're inevitable. Two people will never perceive everything the same way. What matters is not agreement but regulation. A man who stays calm in silence during tension communicates something powerful. He communicates that the connection is bigger than the moment. He's not fighting to win. He's not afraid of losing control. He's staying present. That presence is what women look for when deciding whether a man is emotionally safe long-term. Because long-term safety isn't about perfection. It's about repair. And repair requires space. Silence creates that space. Not the kind that distances, but the kind that allows clarity to emerge. A man who knows when to pause instead of react prevents unnecessary damage. He doesn't say things he'll later need to undo. He doesn't escalate to feel heard. He trusts that being understood can wait. That patience feels like maturity. And maturity feels safe. Now here's something few men can. Women often test silence more as the relationship deepens. Not out of doubt, but out of instinct. They want to know, will this man still be steady when I'm not? Will he stay grounded when I'm emotional? Will he hold his center when I need space? A man who panics in silence answers those questions without realizing it. A man who stays regulated answers them differently. He doesn't chase reassurance. He doesn't withdraw affection. He remains consistent. And consistency over time builds security. Now let's talk about emotional leadership. Leadership is not about directing someone's feelings. It's about modeling how to respond to them. When a man responds to uncertainty with calm, he teaches safety. When he responds to confusion with patience, he teaches trust. And silence is often the medium through which that teaching happens. Because silence allows observation. It allows reflection. It allows both people to locate themselves emotionally. Words can come later, and when they do, they carry more truth. This is why women often say they feel heard by men who don't talk much. Not because those men say the right things, but because they don't interrupt the process of being felt. Being heard isn't about response, it's about allowance. And allowance is felt most strongly in silence. Now here's the deeper layer. When a woman feels emotionally safe long-term, she begins to relax control. She stops managing outcomes. She stops anticipating reactions. She allows herself to be more real, more flawed, more human, and she does this only when she trusts that the man won't collapse under that reality. Silence proves that strength because silence doesn't react, it holds. And holding is what allows love to survive complexity. Before a woman ever feels safe with a man, she senses something even more fundamental, whether he is at peace with himself. This has nothing to do with confidence as performance. Nothing to do with dominance or charm, it's about internal noise. A man who carries chaos inside him brings that chaos into every interaction no matter how softly he speaks. And a man who has learned to quiet his inner world brings calm even when he says nothing at all. Women feel this immediately, because inner silence shapes external presence. A man who is at peace doesn't rush moments. He doesn't rush decisions. He doesn't rush emotional outcomes. He's not trying to extract something from the interaction. He's participating in it. That difference is everything. When a man's inner world is loud, silence feels unbearable. It forces him to face himself. So he fills it with words, with plans, with explanations, with stimulation. But when a man has done the work of understanding himself, silence becomes familiar. It's not empty, it's home. And women feel safe with men who feel at home within themselves. Because that kind of man doesn't use relationships to escape himself. He doesn't need her to regulate his emotions. He doesn't need constant connection to feel real. He brings fullness, not hunger, and fullness creates safety. This is why women often describe certain men as grounded without being able to explain why. Grounded men are internally settled. Their attention is stable. Their reactions are measured. Their silence isn't loaded. It's clean. And clean silence allows intimacy to grow without distortion. Now let's talk about something subtle but crucial. A man at peace doesn't confuse intensity with depth. He doesn't chase emotional highs to feel connected. He allows slow moments, ordinary moments, quiet moments, and women feel safe in those moments because they mirror real life. Life isn't constantly exciting. It's rhythmic, breath in, breath out. Connection that can survive quiet can survive reality. And women are drawn to men who can hold reality without needing it to be entertaining. This is why some men feel deeply attractive without trying. They're not performing, they're inhabiting themselves, and that self-inhabitation creates a gravitational pull. Because when a man is fully in himself, a woman doesn't feel pulled toward him. She feels invited into something stable. Now consider how rare this is. Most people are restless. They live in anticipation, in anxiety, in distraction. So when a woman encounters a man whose silence is calm rather than tense, it stands out. It feels different, not exciting in a frantic way, but soothing. And soothing doesn't kill attraction, it deepens it, because safety allows desire to mature into something lasting. This is where many men misunderstand attraction. They think attraction must be constantly activated. But the strongest attraction doesn't need activation, it needs preservation. Silence preserves attraction by preventing emotional burnout. It allows space for longing, for reflection, for appreciation. Now let's slow down again. A man at peace doesn't need to dominate conversations to feel seen. He doesn't need to assert himself constantly to feel respected. He respects himself. And self-respect is felt long before it's articulated. Women sense it in how he moves, in how he listens, in how he pauses. Those pauses aren't hesitation, they're discernment. And discernment feels safe, because it tells her that when he speaks, he means it, that his words are chosen, that his presence is intentional. This is why women often trust quiet men more over time, not because those men reveal less, but because what they reveal feels considered, earned, reliable. Now here's the final layer before we move on. Silence doesn't make a man attractive. Alignment does. Silence simply removes the noise that hides alignment. When a man lives in alignment with his values, his boundaries, his emotional reality, he doesn't need to convince anyone of who he is. He lets time do the work. And time combined with calm presence creates trust. There's a moment that often goes unnoticed. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly. A woman realizes she feels safest with the man who never tried to make her feel safe. He didn't say the right things. He didn't promise anything. He didn't manage her emotions. He simply remained himself. And over time, that consistency settled into her body. This realization usually comes in contrast. She notices how she feels after spending time with him, calm, clear, grounded. Then she notices how she feels around others, drained, alert, slightly tense. And the difference becomes impossible to ignore. This is when silence reveals its final power, because silence doesn't create safety in a single moment. It creates safety through repetition, through sameness, through emotional reliability. A man who speaks less but remains present becomes a reference point. She begins to orient around him emotionally, not because she depends on him, but because her nervous system recognizes stability. And stability is rare. Now here's something important. This doesn't mean she won't challenge him. In fact, she often will, because safety allows honesty. She may question, she may doubt, she may express fears. And the man doesn't shut down, he doesn't rush to defend, he listens. He responds when there is something real to say. And sometimes he lets silence do the work. That silence isn't avoidance, it's trust in the process. Women feel safest when they're allowed to come to their own conclusions, when they don't feel steered, when they don't feel convinced. The man who speaks less gives her that freedom, and freedom deepens attachment more than persuasion ever could. Now let's talk about how this feels from her side. She doesn't feel watched. She doesn't feel evaluated. She doesn't feel like she has to perform emotionally. She can change her mind. She can be quiet. She can be uncertain. And the man stays steady. That steadiness becomes a kind of emotional shelter, not dramatic, not intense, but real. This is why women often describe these men as solid. Not exciting in a fleeting way, but dependable. And dependence is not the same as dependency. Dependence is knowing something will hold when leaned on. And silence proves that holding capacity. Because silence doesn't collapse under weight. Now consider this. A man who fills every space with words leaves no room for discovery. But a man who leaves space allows her to discover herself with him. And that shared discovery creates intimacy. Not because he revealed everything, but because he allowed everything. Now here's the subtle truth. At some point, the woman stops tracking his silence. It becomes normal, natural, comforting, and that's when trust has fully formed. Silence no longer feels like something happening between them. It feels like something they share. And shared silence is one of the deepest forms of intimacy. It means nothing needs to be proven, nothing needs to be explained, nothing needs to be managed, just presence, just being. When everything finally settles, what remains is not attraction tactics, not communication strategies, not effort. What remains is how it felt to be with you. A woman does not feel safest with the man who always knew what to say. She feels safest with the man who did not disappear when there was nothing to say. Because silence is where character lives. When there is no conversation to hide behind, no emotion to perform, no moment to control, only presence remains. And presence tells the truth. A man who is at ease with himself does not rush silence. He does not tense inside it. He does not abandon connection just because words stop. He stays, not clingingly, not distantly, but steadily, and that steadiness becomes emotional ground. Over time, a woman begins to trust that ground. She notices that her body relaxes around him, that she doesn't need to explain herself as much, that she doesn't feel rushed to decide, respond, or perform. She can arrive as she is, and nothing collapses. That is safety, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but reveals itself over time. This is why women often choose the man who never competed for attention. The man who didn't flood the space with words. The man who didn't try to manage emotions. The man who allowed silence to exist without turning it into distance. Because that man showed her something rare. That connection doesn't require pressure. That intimacy doesn't require urgency. That closeness doesn't require noise, just presence. Silence, when it's grounded, is not emptiness. It's capacity. The capacity to hold emotion without fixing it. To stay regulated when things are unclear. To remain kind without performing kindness. And women feel safest with men who have that capacity. Because life is not always expressive. Love is not always verbal. And connection is not always loud. What lasts is the ability to stay emotionally available when things get quiet. So if there is one truth to carry with you, it's this: you do not need to speak less to be attractive. You need to be at peace enough that silence does not scare you. When silence no longer feels like a threat inside you, it stops feeling like one to her. And that calm, unforced, unperformed, deeply human is what safety feels like in the end.